go ahead and jump to your file directory and open up the fourth step, which is called More Flexible Validation. Go ahead and copy the entire code and paste it over the code that's currently in your assets.module file and save it. Okay, so we're adding some code in a couple different areas here. Our first change is in the assets unmanaged file form validate function. Now remember, this is our validation function for the form that we built originally. And we're building an array here called validators. What we're going to put in this array is a set of key value pairs where the key is the name of the validation function and the value is an array of parameters that will be passed to this function. In this case, the file validate extensions function is a core validation function, and it takes as its first parameter a list of extensions separated by spaces that are considered valid for the input. If this isn't passed as an explicit validation to an input, then a set of default extensions that are known to be safe are passed instead. And this file validate extensions actually runs whenever we run file save upload, even though we don't specify it, but it runs it on a different set of extensions. So you might be surprised at the results if you don't specify the extensions explicitly. You can also pass an empty array, which means that any type of file is allowed for this input. The second item in our validators array is a function that we'll define in this module after this form validation function. And what we're doing is basically taking the validation that we created in our last step and moving it out into a function that can be used by any file input. And instead of testing just against a single string, we're passing the string as a parameter so somebody can test for any string inside of the file name. In this case, we're still continuing to test for test dot, but we could replace this with something else if we'd like. And we'll take a look at this function in a moment. Now, the way that we pass these validators is through the file save upload. Notice our first parameter remains the same. Again, this is the name of the file input. As a second parameter, we're passing the validators. As a third parameter, we can pass a destination, but in this case, what we want to do is save this file to a temporary location, because if this file save upload doesn't work properly, or there's some other validation that this form doesn't pass, we don't want to put this file in a permanent place. So what we're saying here is we're handling the file in our temp directory so it can be cleared out later if this validation doesn't pass ultimately. As a fourth parameter, we can use a constant to specify what we want to do if a file name already exists in this directory that has the same file name as the file that we're uploading. In this case, we're specifying it to replace it if it exists, but by default, this is set to rename new files that would normally replace existing files to have a number appended to the end of the file name. So what we're doing here is not default behavior. There are a few additional validation functions inside of core. One is file validate size, which allows you to validate the actual file size and determine whether it might be too big or too small, depending on what your needs are. You could validate whether the item is an image, and this would be useful to us. Instead, what we're doing is simply checking for a set of extensions that are known to be image extensions. We can check for image resolution if a user is not allowed to upload an image that's beyond a certain size. We could check that. And we can check the name of the file to make sure it's not too long to fit in the database. In this case, we don't really care because this is an unmanaged file. But these are some validation functions that are in core that you can look at for additional validation or for examples of building your own. Okay, So other than this section here, everything else is the same in this function, but we need to take a look at our assets validate not in file name function. So I'm going to scroll down. It's down here at the bottom. So you see we have our one parameter that's the same as our previous validation function, which is the file object. And notice that it's being passed as a reference. You can tell because of this ampersand here. That means that any changes that we make to that file object will get passed to the parent functions that have called this function. And second, we're setting a parameter called string, which is the string that we're testing for, and we're setting it to a default of test dot. Other than that second parameter here, this function is exactly the same as what we're doing in file validate here, the hook file validate function. We have a slightly different error message so that we can tell when one of these errors is being triggered versus the other. So let's go ahead and jump back to our browser. And let's go ahead and submit this test.jpg file again and see what happens. Okay, sure enough, we have our two error messages. We have our first one and our second one. Notice that our validation function that we just defined gets run first, and then the hook function runs after that. In our next step, what we're going to do is take a look at how to actually process the file once it's been validated and it passes.